What's up, guys? It's Morgan here with Spirit and Life Fitness. We are going to discuss virtues today. Virtues as in the abstract. Now, in order to completely understand, we are going to define what virtues are. And on Wikipedia, virtue is defined as moral excellence. And these virtues have been deemed morally good. Why? I don't know. We're going to be looking at the applied virtues versus the abstract virtues in themselves, because we get into the argument of the metaphysical good versus evil, so on and so forth. Now, there are three types that we're going to be covering today. We're going to be covering the Platonic style of virtue, the Aristotelian style of virtue, and we're going to move into the Catholic style of virtue. Although there are so many others all across the world, we're just going to stick with those three today. Platonic virtue is, or better known as the classical virtues, the classical cardinal, I should say, are temperance, prudence, courage, and justice. Temperance being defined as a moderation of yourself, prudence being ruling yourself with logic and reason, courage being able to go forward against uncomfort or uncertainty, and justice being the moderation between selfishness and selflessness. Now, these are very concrete definitions of virtues and that Plato gave. Whenever we move forward to look at Aristotle's idea of virtue, we find a very different one. In the book Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle had elaborated on virtue as being a state where you are not at an excess of a action or at a deficient, well, not really an action, but the excess or deficiency of a concept. Like bravery would be the virtue, whereas bravado or self-destructive confidence would be the extreme, and cowardice would be the deficiency. Now, what makes Aristotelian virtue so interesting is that Aristotle had actually said that sometimes these virtues can be closer to the extremes than others. So, for example, the brave person is more able to relate to the person who's foolish and charges into battle than the coward. Now, that being said, there are also behaviors that Aristotle said that could never be virtue, and these were thievery, murder, adultery, and a few others that don't come to mind at the moment. I'm doing this off the top of my head. The reason that these cannot be virtues in any way, shape, or form is because the actions themselves are derived out of an excess, like thievery, adultery, and murder would all be excesses of whatever we're going to talk about is tied with those actions. Now we're going to move on to the 7 heavenly virtues of the Catholic Church. Now, this is important because we are going to see a crossover between classical thinking and the Catholic thinking as it should be. Now, these 7 virtues are chastity, temperance, charity, diligence, patience, kindness, humility, and that's it. Now, we're going to break down what these are, what they mean, and at the end of this, we're going to tie them all together and see why they're important to keeping our civilization the way it is, how these things can not be measured per se, but one could certainly attain a sense of virtuousness from practicing these effects or traits. Now, chastity, we mostly know chastity through sexual purity and things of that nature, but it also means living in good health, avoiding drinking, and things like that. It also means intellectual honesty across the board, to all of God's creations, with yourself, with your family, and just everything. Now, education, self-betterment, and other things, they embrace moral wholesomeness. And this is good because whenever we look at what the conceptions are of the church, it comes out of this thought of ignorance. But the idea of chastity, my apologies, it proves in and of itself that purity of thought can only come from self-betterment and education. But the last point for chastity would be the ability to refrain from being distracted and influenced by hostility, temptation, or corruption, which just kind of just goes along a normal guideline. If you want to hold any of the aforementioned points, you have to have some sort of resistance, some pushback against the temptations that would pick apart those other things in chastity. Now, temperance is a little bit easier to define because temperance doesn't have that many definitions tied with it, or what they could be. Temperance is self-control. It's moderation, deferring gratification, being able to see things further down the line. And it's also the ability to see a why. Temperance can be, I would define it as empathy towards a situation. Like you're able to relate to somebody, see why they did an action, the reasoning for it, and respond to it accordingly with that information. The third is charity. Now, charity as we know it today more often than not means financial donations and benevolent giving. But charity could be better used as self-sacrifice, is how most church historians would argue the term. Now, charity is more than just self-sacrifice. It is love to all things. It's like a sense of an unlimited kindness towards all others. This love is meant to be the perfection of the human spirit, and because it represents the entire glory and the nature of God, because God is all loving, all merciful, all powerful. Now, that being said, we will not forget that God also, because he's like us, and we can infer that he also is all wrathful and all those other things. But the nature of God also has us. The best reflection of the Lord in us is to be all loving. And now we're going to diligence. Diligence is important because it brings out an idea of pursuing things to their very end. If you have any of the other virtues but you don't have diligence, none of the virtues seem to stick together, because diligence is being able to go and overtake these things no matter what may stand in your way, going to push through beyond boundaries, barriers, and to hold true to your virtues no matter what kind of temptation may come in your way. Patience is really a self-explanatory virtue. Now, the reason that I would say patience is self-explanatory and doesn't need further explanation is because of things like the deferral of gratification, self-improvement, self-betterment. All of these things require patience at their very core. So we're just going to move past that. Kindness. Now, this could also be benevolence, things like that. And this would be kindness in the liturgical sense would be an unselfish love, something like the I give but do not expect receiving, like a cheerful demeanor, something like that. No matter what comes your way, you're just going to keep the smile up and going. Humility and virtue are probably one of the easiest things to tie in together. Humility, the reason humility is a virtue is because in order to have all the other virtues, aside from patience, you need to have the ability to level with yourself, to think that I am only this far, not I have made it this far, because the reality is in the infinity of the universe, you can only make it so far. To quote Plato, I know everything because I know nothing. That ability to recognize that you are not God. You are merely just a man confined within a mortal shell, and you are, aside from other things, you are stuck with the concreteness of the world around us, which is stuck to the rules of the world around us. And I decided to go over these virtues today, make it the topic of a video, because these virtues are representative of why Christendom has been able to bring people so far. The idea that chastity would mean self-improvement, purity of thought and knowledge, in order to tie it in with so many of the other virtues, with diligence, with other things, we can pursue God. We can see Him through lines that are not necessarily, they are inherently Christian thinking, but they were not. That we can look outside of Christianity to see and feel what God is, because God is present in all of us. This soul, this spark of divine nature that is incumbent in each and every human being, it is something that links us, and we can find value in these things, which is perhaps the reason why Christian thinkers, St. Thomas Aquinas comes to mind, were able to link Aristotelian thought or Platonic thought, and we're able to find value in their thoughts, because we see that consistency, reason, logic, evidence is the way to approach the mind of God, to become closer with Him. The closer and closer we follow these things, the more and more consistent we find the universe to be, and we can see God coming through within these lines of thinking. And that is why I believe that these virtues are needed. I believe we should use them to the fullest of their ability, and I believe we should use them to find God and improve humans in our own nature. Thank you very much for watching, guys. Be sure, or if you don't want to, but I ask that you please leave a like, comment, and maybe subscribe if you want to. If you comment, be sure to leave questions. I'll try my best to get to them in a future video. This has been Morgan from Spirit and Life Fitness. We'll try doing these a little bit better next time, but until then, I'll see you guys around.